The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
In this episode of Postcards.
In jazz, you get to create the stuff that you want to play. So that's really what I like the most about it.
When I teach a class, I usually prepare a rough out. That's what this is. It started out as a block of wood.
When we went through a storm, nobody went up topside.
This program on Pioneer Public Television is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yekel Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org. The Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center, your ideal choice for Minnesota resorts offering luxury townhomes, 18 holes of golf, Darling Reflection Spa, Big Splash Water Park, and much more. Alexandria, Minnesota, a relaxing vacation or great location for an event. Explore alex.com. Easy to get to, hard to leave.
Join us as Ross Anderson and Pete Lothringer of Marshall jazz up to town at Central High School in Slayton.
My dad was a great fan of Dixieland jazz and had a large collection of Dixieland records. Pete Fountain, the Dukes of Dixieland, Louis Armstrong, Al Hirt, all the old New Orleans. I was 9 years old. And then when I was 13, I was a freshman in high school, and the band director said, well, we have a tenor saxophone at the school, and if you can learn to play it, you can be in the jazz band. So I brought the tenor home, tenor saxophone, and according to my mom, I sat down and played for 8 hours without stop. Once I learned to play that, then I, began to think that I would like to be able to play some of the jazz like I was hearing on the records. So that was really the start of it.
I got interested in jazz music fairly early in my career. Played one or two songs in a cover band, a Duke Ellington tune or something, and it was quite a bit different than the rock and country I was more familiar with at the time. And over the years, just investigated more and more, and eventually, after meeting my partner here in Marshall, Ross Anderson, started really learning a lot of the tunes and delving into it much more deeply. So it was a very long, decades-long kind of slow immersion in jazz. Met up with Ross, and he's a real jazz musician. He's been doing it since he was a kid, and so I just took that as an opportunity to really learn about it. And
Pete is an extraordinary player. He covers, you know, parts that would normally be played by a bass, and covers the chords that would be played by a piano, and then also, of course, there's the rhythm aspect of it. So you need the right guitar player to do that.
When people show up just to hear you play your music, then you play much better because there's an energy there. They appreciate it too, and if it goes well, you know, some of them are going to pick up on that, and that's kind of what makes it all worthwhile in the end, I think.
In jazz, you get to create the stuff that you want to play. So that's really what I like the most about it.
Visit Pioneer.org for more information on postcards and other Pioneer productions. Woodcarver Don Fisher shows us his talents at carving caricatures and animals alike.
Just roughing out this bear to kind of get the legs positioned and so on. Keep them kind of balanced like that one is. This is when you really make the chips fly. When you start doing the detail work, then it's almost like dust. But this is a sound I love. It's the sound of the wood slice, the chisel slicing through the wood. It gets to be kind of a rhythm and almost like music. Well, my name is Don Fisher, and I do wood carving art. I specialize in doing figure carving. Usually I do caricatures of real people or carvings of some kind of animal, critter, anything that's alive. And it's just kind of an interesting hobby to be involved in it. I find it very relaxing. Some people say they wouldn't have the patience to do that. And I'm not really a particularly patient person, but I find it relaxing to carve. When I started carving, most of my carving is done in basswood. I do also carve in butternut. I've carved in walnut and cherry and pine and some other kinds of wood, but the basswood and butternut are my favorites. Probably more out of basswood than butternut, because butternut is getting to be very expensive. But the basswood is very carvable, and it takes detail very well, and it's easy to paint on because it has a good palette surface. And then, well, what you do is you figure out what you want to carve. You make a pattern, and you lay that out on the wood, whatever dimension you have to have for the wood. It may be 2 inches or 4 inches thick, and however long you need, and you cut out on a bandsaw the profile from the side and from the front, and that kind of takes off some of the excess wood off that block of wood. When I teach a class, I usually prepare a rough out. That's what this is. It's started out as a block of wood, about 4.5 by 4 inches, and it's about 9 inches tall. And I use basswood when I make my roughouts. Most of my carvings are done in basswood because it's not quite as hard as some woods. It has a nice consistent grain to it, so it takes detail and paint very well, and that's why people like to carve with it. And of course you have to always be drawing lines as to where the leg is going to go. You have to kind of imagine in your head what the skeleton of the animal is like. Otherwise, it'll look kind of funny. And they have some of the same kind of bone structures that people have, but they just, some are different lengths than what people are. And sometimes you get into a spot in the wood where it's a little harder, and you can actually work up a sweat doing this, even on a cool day. So it's nice to have your studio in the basement like this, where in the summertime you get in out of the heat, and in the wintertime you don't have to worry about freezing to death. Some people have their studios out in a shop someplace, and then you got to heat that too. So, but with this, I can get up in the morning and come down and carve, and if my wife wants to sleep in, I don't bother her, which I hope she appreciates. Then I'll use a wood burner to texture the hair, so from a distance it looks like it's got hair. Actually, you just texture clumps of hair. with his head turned like that, you have to be careful to keep things squared away the way they're supposed to be. Because this side of the barrel will be stretched and this one here will be compressed as you do the final carving. And so you got to keep that balance in there too. So of course, like most people, you end up buying tools and you end up having some that you don't use as much, and some are your favorites. They have a saying that among carvers that he who dies with the most tools wins, but I say he who dies with the most tools is still dead. So you might as well use your common sense while you're making purchases. I always tell people that in my classes that I teach that carving is an illusion, as is all art. And I show them a carving and I say, "What is it?" And they'll always comment that it's a bear. Well, looks like a bear, but it's really just a piece of wood with some paint on it. So that's the illusion. But you try to trick people's eyes into seeing something and appreciating the form.
Have you missed a show you'd like to see? Pioneer On Demand has all of your favorite productions available to watch online at your convenience, including past episodes of Postcards. World War II veteran Earl W. Orr recounts his experience in the U.S. Navy at Pagan Fighters World War II Museum in Granite Falls.
I was in the Navy from for 1943, 44, 45, and half of 46. I was a storekeeper, second class, in the U.S. Navy, and I worked in the supply department of a ship, and I was on the same ship in the 1 year in the Atlantic and about 2.5 years in the Pacific. On the same ship, went through the Panama Canal because we were in the Atlantic at the start of the early part of the war, because that was when the war was in Africa, North Africa, and we were on a supply ship, so we were supplying food and fuel and stuff there. And then when Africa got pretty well taken care of, and then they sent us to the Pacific, and so we had to have our anti-submarine weapons, guns and everything, taken off a ship and put on anti-aircraft weapons, guns. And and then we spent the rest of the time in the Pacific. In a supply department in a ship, you do a lot of things. I was involved in getting food for the crew. We had a crew of about 475 people, men, and I was all kinds of clothing that people would need, and pay. My major job really was a paymaster. So I mean, I figured pay for the people aboard ship. And when we had other ships come aboard, smaller ships, you know, they didn't have money, and so they came to us and came aboard our ship and brought their executive officer usually brought the records, and I'd sit there and figure out how much each man in that ship. And they only, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, or it's all I had on those smaller ships, and I figured out how much they had coming, and so they'd come to see me, and they wanted to get money. So I said, "How much do you want?" All of it. They always want all of it, because that was their gambling fund. When we went through a storm, nobody went up topside. You had to almost go through a tunnel to go from quarters in the back, living quarters in the back, to the bridge to watch. and that water it was just like the ship was underwater almost, because it was all going over, the waves going over all come on one side of the ship and off the other side. So we had a big ship. It was a big supply repair ship. It was about 475 feet long. See, that's 1.5 foot a football field. Well, I tell you, the planes are a lot nicer looking than the ones we saw over around. We saw a kind of a different. Planes flying over, we always ducked, but we had other ships around us protecting us. Because we were a supply ship in a war area, and if anything happened to them, they had damage or something, need repairs or something, we were there. But they were awful protective of us. They knew a supply ship is what all their friends needed, so they took good care of us, made sure that we didn't get bombed. Those 3.5 years I spent in the Navy were very educational and very interesting, and I learned a lot about history and science and everything else.
Do you use Facebook, Twitter, or other social media? Connect with us to get immediate access to behind-the-scenes videos, previews, and other postcards and Pioneer news.
The program on Pioneer Public Television is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yackel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org. The Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center, your ideal choice for Minnesota resorts offering luxury townhomes, 18 holes of golf, Darling Reflection Spa, Big Splash Water Park, and much more. Alexandria, Minnesota, a relaxing vacation or great location for an event. Explore alex.com. Easy to get to, hard to leave.